So I've been accumulating questions on the Leave Your Comments and Questions video, and I finally have enough to actually do a video specifically about topics in religion because people have been asking me that. So here are 10 shorts. I'm going to try to keep them under 2 minutes each, where I answer viewers and subscribers' questions, comments, challenges, complaints about religion. So this is an interesting and provocative question by Carl George. Do you think faith is the most dishonest position someone could take? And the simple answer, of course, is no. There are many more positions that one could take that are explicitly dishonest, like lying, cheating, stealing, being a murderer for hire, being a witness tamperer, any of those sort of things. Um, I think it's an interesting question in part because it betrays a kind of, uh, what should we call it? I hesitate to use the word sloppiness, but rather sort of a tar everything with the same brush, oversimplifying, you know, de-differentiating kind of thinking that is really, I know we all tend to fall into this, but it's no good when you actually want to talk about anything seriously. Is faith a position? Well, what does it mean to have a position? And what do people who actually talk about faith, let alone people for whom faith is important, who say that they live out faith or, it's an integral part of their lives, what do they actually mean by that? If you just want to sort of engage in polemics, you don't have to worry about that. If you actually want to know anything about the phenomenon that you're talking about, then you actually have to look at what religious believers mean by it. Do they mean a set of propositions to which everybody is assumed to assent who has faith? Some people think of that way. Other people think of it in terms of a sort of lived commitment that becomes clearer and clearer over time, the more that one is actually engaging in it. Some people think of it as a relationship. Is there anything inherently dishonest about it? I suppose if you've already sort of prejudiced the question by staking out, all people who are religious must be crazy or nuts or something like that, then you would think so. But if you're open-minded, no. So this is an interesting question by Emmy Sta. Do you personally believe that in high schools, if evolution is taught, shouldn't creationism be taught as well? And my answer to that is a little bit complex. So first of all, we have to be careful about what we mean by taught. Do we mean in the sense of presented as the only thing that one can think in this form of proselytizing? I mean, if evolution is being taught in schools in a scientific manner, genuine scientists are fairly humble about their epistemological commitments. But I think that a lot of high school science teachers are not so. They see themselves as sort of crusaders for enlightenment or things like that. That said, I don't believe that creationism and scientific theories about evolution are really on the same level. I'd place creationism a bit lower. Now, if we're talking about teaching, there's also the way of teaching where you say, well, look, this is what, people who see things this way, this is how they see it this way. And at the high school level, it's not like you're actually teaching high-level evolutionary theory. You're basically just teaching a bit about it, unless you're in some really super advanced high school, in which case, all bets are off. So I think it's perfectly fine to say, here's what most mainstream scientists think, and here's what a lot of Americans actually think is probably the most correct way. Here's what creationists think. If you're going to do that, though, you probably should also deal with other things like intelligent design, which is, in my view, a third alternative that doesn't reduce to either one of them. And if you really want to get advanced with it, you should probably teach about the history of the notion of evolution and about how, this would really be to be scientific, to show how these things actually developed over time, show the evolution of evolution. But that doesn't get done. And most of the debates remain at this very low level of creationism versus evolution with a capital, letter for both of them, which is unfortunate. So Rick Seven Jr. has a number of questions for me about things having to do with the Bible, and he asked, what are your views on biblical inerrancy? If by biblical inerrancy you mean what the people who tend to talk about it quite a bit mean, it's something I'm rather uninterested in. I'm rather traditional in this respect, that I am a religious believer, and I believe that God speaks to us through the Scriptures, but I don't believe that it's any sort of like it's laid out for you, and you don't have to do work on your part and make the effort to try to figure out what the context was, what the times were. And am I committed to every single thing in the Bible being literally true? No. And as a matter of fact, there's plenty of great Christian authors in the past who I look to as sort of lighthouses or landmarks for me, who didn't think that that was particularly central either, who were more interested in the significance or the meaning of it, and who could also see that not everything is on the same plane. If, for example, you want to say that Jesus didn't say that we ought to turn the other cheek, well, that's a big thing. I think that things actually turn on that. If you want to say that in the Bible, people say that pi is 3 rather than 3.14. I don't care. Nothing turns on that. And there's everything in between. So I think that a lot of people get really worked up about biblical inerrancy because they want the Bible to be something that it's not, which is to be some sort of purely immanent, everything is completely correct in it sort of thing. And then their critics, seize on that and easily point out things that, are inconsistencies, at least on the surface. Another question by Rick Seven Jr. What are your views on the historicity of Jesus? So there's two ways we could look at this. One is asking, did this guy even exist? Was he remotely similar to what the canonical scriptures record him as being? And in this respect, we can ask about the historicity of Socrates, the historicity of the Buddha, and there are actually, quests for the historical, Buddha out there, just like there are quests for the historical Jesus. There are a few people who want to say, yeah, this guy's totally made up, no person like that ever existed. They're so far out on the fringe that they're not taken seriously even by most of the fringe scholars. So in that respect, yeah, the guy existed. He walked around. He, was most likely crucified. No reason to think that he wasn't. The question then is, how much of the canonical scriptures can we say is actually reflective of what was going on at the time? My views are pretty traditional in this respect. I don't see any reason to call into question whether Jesus said the things that are attributed to him. And you can say, well, it's in this gospel, but not in this gospel. Well, they're written for different purposes. When I would teach classes on the canonical and non-canonical gospels, one of the things I would point out to my students is, look, we don't know what he ate on Thursday, March 17th in this year, but that doesn't mean that we don't have some information about the guy. They were very selective in what they thought ought to get passed on. And that's, there are different theological emphases from gospel to gospel. I don't think that our views on Jesus as a historical figure are particularly illuminated by non-canonical documents. They can lend a little bit of light mostly about what these Christians over here were thinking, or these Gnostics over here were thinking. But for the most part, we're stuck going back to the canonical texts. All right, another question by Rick Seven Jr. To what extent does it really matter if there are mistakes or things we know are false in the Bible? Totally depends on what thing it is, in my view. Because I don't think that the entire, I don't usually talk about the Bible as one single document anyway. Bible comes from ta Biblia, meaning the books. Another word for that would be library. And these are texts that are written at different times and compiled together and felt to, as a whole, encompass the Word of God. Now, you got to ask yourself, with respect to any one particular bit of information, what would be the case if this turns out to be false? If, to use the example I used before, if the Hebrews were deceived about the nature of pi, the number, I don't care. Nobody cares. Only quibblers care about that sort of thing. If, on the other hand, we were to find out that Jesus actually didn't teach things like you should pray for your enemies, you should, be like the Good Samaritan, and instead he said you ought to. Here'd be the mistake. He actually said it's every man for himself. Screw your neighbor as much as you can. Well, that would be a huge, change, right? That would be pretty revelatory. But not even in any sort of non-canonical text do we find anything remotely like that. To what extent does it really matter if there are mistakes or things that we know are wrong in the Bible? Totally depends on the thing, depends on what would be different or what upshot that would have. And you got to ask, in a lot of cases, do we, if we think something is wrong, are we really sure about that? Are we right about that? Or is that like based on some sort of supposition, some conspiracy theory, some tendency to want to, be in the know by showing people up? That's what I find in a lot of these discourses. Here I'm going to give a totally unsatisfying answer to Mark Smith, who asks me, could you elaborate on the terminology used in Trinitarian theology of essence, substance, nature, and person? What does each term refer to, and how do they differ? So in a 2-minute video, no, I'm not going to be able to elaborate on the terminology used in Trinitarian theology, upon which I can't even myself claim to have a particularly great grasp, not only because, these terms are used in the different languages, I'll get to that in a moment, in somewhat different ways, but also overlapping ways, but also because I actually do happen to think that the Trinity is something that's particularly hard to grasp for us human beings. So, here's the only thing that I have to say that's of any merit when it comes to this. If we look at authors who actually do talk about this, like for example, St. Anselm, we got words like essence, substance, nature, and person. And, a Greek term like ousia might be translated as essentia, might be translated as substantia, in Latin. And somebody like Anselm is really hip to that. He knows that different languages use these words in different ways, and that different authors use these in different ways. So the key is to look at what they claim this particular term has rolled up into it, and what sort of upshot that has. That's all I really have to contribute on this. I'm sorry, but I'm not I'm not even a mediocre theologian. So Jacob Hall has an interesting question here. In terms of religious experience, who do you find most interesting? Specifically, what about Merton? That is Thomas Merton. So let me answer that part, the last part first. I've read Thomas Merton, and I'm not really into him or the kind of writers that do the same sort of thing that he does. I like his narrative parts, but I'm not particularly into his discussions, particularly about mysticism, because I tend to be myself rather an anti-mystic. I think that God is intelligible, and that although we may have a hard time communicating what it is that we have experienced or insights we've gained or the nature of God, that we were given reason, and we were given the capacity to articulate things for a purpose. And I think that a lot of mysticism, I'm not saying Merton actually falls in this, but a lot of mysticism is kind of a cop-out. It's like cheap theology. So I am very, very interested in religious experience. I'm not particularly interested in secondary sources sort of talking about religious experience, although I do like William James quite a bit. I'm interested in actually looking at what the primary sources have to say. So, if somebody had a religious experience, I want to read them and read their account of it. One thing I will say though is I don't consider religious experience and religious insight and thinking about the matters of religion to be totally dichotomous. So thinking is an experience. What happens in contemplation is an experience just as much as poking myself in the face is an experience. It's a different type of experience. So Rick Seven Jr. has a question specifically on Bart Ehrman. What do you think of the work of Bart D. Ehrman, since some people seem to think that his books and findings present a fatal blow to Christianity? So first, if his books and findings were to present a fatal blow to Christianity, that would be an incredible surprise. As a matter of fact, let's even take Ehrman out of the picture. If somebody were to come up with some sort of, scholarship that showed that it's all a big hoax and actually was real scholarship, not just a lot of sort of wishful thinking and, well, it could be this way, so I bet you it is this way, hermeneutics of suspicion kind of stuff, that would indeed be earth-shaking. Nothing like that has happened, and nothing like that is likely to happen anytime soon. And people have been trying to do this for quite some time. Ehrman is an interesting guy. I actually have used his work in teaching classes on the New Testament and about canonical and non-canonical gospel literature. And what I used was his early work, which was actually, it had a particular ideological edge to it. It was very clear that he didn't like the Orthodox, and he was much more sympathetic to the non-Orthodox, or particularly to the Gnostics. But it was still good scholarship. It was still stuff that you could say, well, he's making an argument for this, and it's a plausible argument, and I think that his translations, we can use those, and his contextualizations provide us with some help. So that's how he made his bones. Then he progressively went off into further and further, fringe stuff, with plenty of, backing from people like the Jesus Seminar. The thing that turned it for me, that turned me off on him, was his stuff that he wrote about the Gospel of Judas, which was just ludicrous. And it became very difficult for me to take him seriously as a scholar after that. I won't even say what I think it is. So Euro Rumor has a question for me about raising my kids and faith. He says, did you raise them, or are you currently raising them as Christians? If so, how did you or do you keep them open and free thinkers? So it's interesting that the background assumption should be that if you're actually doing some sort of religious education or talking in any meaningful way about faith, and not just doing so in the kind of religious studies, well, here's what these people think, here's what these people think, that you're sort of indoctrinating them or keeping them from being able to develop openness. So first off, even if we take the religion off the table, if you don't teach something substantive, you actually preclude the possibility of open-mindedness, because this is the way people's minds develop. You need to actually grapple with things to be able to take a critical position on them. If all you have is some vague, notions about it, you can't even really take a critical position on it. Another way of putting this is, in very practical terms, is it's good to teach, something so that kids actually have something to react and rebel against. Now, it is possible to teach in kind of a brainwashing fashion, and I've seen people do that, and I've seen them do that in all sorts of denominations, and I've seen people do that who are atheists as well. I personally think, and this is part of why I belong to the Christian intellectual tradition, that if you're actually using your mind the way that God wants you to be using your mind, you're not going to be brainwashed yourself, and you're not going to be brainwashing anybody else. You are, in fact, going to be inculcating in them a real love for the truth that will lead them to try to figure out what's what. And yeah, that's probably enough about that. So this is a bit of a follow-up question from your rumor. And here's it's off of the, raising kids as Christians. If you did raise them as Christians and when they were 6 years old, they were asked whether they believed in God, would they have said yes or no? If they were asked why they believe what they believe, what would they have said? What would you have wanted them to say to both questions? So that's a lot of questions all rolled up in one. So first off, let me say this. I think it's great if kids at 6 years old believe in God. I don't think that their conception of God is hopefully it's nothing like what they're going to have when they're 16 years old and 26 years old. It's going to be something much more rudimentary. It's hard as hell for us adults even to figure out what exactly God is, in part because of the nature of the very object of that knowledge. We wouldn't expect that a kid is going to have perfect knowledge about that either, or be able to provide particularly cogent explanations. I would hope that my kids would be able to say more than, well, my dad believes in God, so I believe in God. But, I don't compel God. So I don't decide what sort of relationship God has with my kids. And what would I have wanted them to say? I would want them to say what they actually think. And I would want it to be reflective of where they are, because I don't think that wherever they are at 6 years old is where they're going to be, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from then. What all of this reminds me of a lot is that, in the Christian tradition, we have a long, long history of people saying, man, I was totally wrong about God. My conceptions of God at this time were dead off. Read Augustine's Confessions. You'll see him say that over and over and over again. Very often our own imaginings about God, even if we say we believe in God, tend to be things that keep us from, truly knowing God and being engaged with God.